Hello again. Great to be back with you here. Michael McGovern joining you. Hope you're making it okay through our quarantine social distancing situation. Again, for all of our senior residents in retirement homes around the Northwoods of Wisconsin and elsewhere, we are thinking of you and want you to be well and know that you're not alone. All of other folks also listening in social distancing, hi, how do you too? We're going to read more of David Maraniss' fantastic book, When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi. To get you caught up, he had just finished coaching his first year, freshman football coach for his old alma mater, Fordham University. And this will, I'm sure, shock you. Vince was awesome at coaching. Okay, it worked out really well for him. This freshman team was astonishing, and the varsity team was fairly terrible with their coach who's going to measure up to Vince Lombardi? But this guy, he had a losing record, and pretty much deservedly so. So, we're joining him at the end of that season, and this is kind of Vince's expectations at this point. At season's end, Lombardi was rewarded with a new job, but not the one he expected. He was asked belatedly to step in and coach Fordham's freshman basketball team. The team had become vacant when Bob Mulvihill, who was slated to coach the freshmen, instead unexpectedly was declared eligible to play one final year with the varsity after returning from the Marine Corps as a 25-year-old senior. Lombardi had been a successful high school basketball coach, leading one of his Saints teams to a regional championship during the war years, so he was considered the logical replacement. In fact, he had no interest in the job and knew less about the game than most of the Rams players. One of the freshman cagers that winter was Dick Tarrant, who later became a respected basketball coach at Richmond University. As Tarrant remembered that season, Lombardi was an odd mentor, largely preoccupied with football. The players respected him and dared not challenge him. They learned that if practice was at 3 o'clock, they were wise to show up at 2:30. He made them run laps, quote, which was absurd in basketball, Terrence noted, since basketball scrimmages were nonstop running in any case, and set them up in a simple offense from which he would not stray. But for the most part, he left the players alone, realizing that their skills surpassed his knowledge and interest in the sport. Quote, he didn't know any of us and didn't really care to. He was babysitting us for that year, Terrence said. Often, while the team was shooting baskets or running layup drills, Lombardi slipped off to a corner of the gym where a huddle of football players waited, and he went through the snap and ballet with his center and quarterbacks. The basketball team appeared bulky and overpopulated at times, as Lombardi brought linemen in to run laps with lanky forwards and guards. Sometimes at night, after studying football films for an hour, he walked across the campus hill against the howling winter wind and encountered a pack of athletes trudging back from dinner to their dorm in a former Army barracks behind the gym. He would ignore the basketball players in the group and focus his attention on the shivering grid men. Did you work out today? Do your sit-ups? The basketball players appreciated their anonymity. Not only was Lombardi's energy elsewhere, but also his wrath. Lombardi that winter was nonetheless, as usual, intense and nervous for better or worse. His will to compete was inevitably contagious, even in a sport that mattered less to him. During a meaningless freshman basketball game against Hofstra, Wagner, or St. John's, played 2 hours before the varsity contest, with only a few girlfriends and student loiterers in the stands, a gym so empty you could hear the vendors selling popcorn and Coke behind the stands on the other side of the court, Lombardi might launch into one of his eye-blinking spasms in response to a referee's ill-conceived foul call. There was one other characteristic that his basketball players never forgot about Lombardi, the freshman basketball coach. He had a noticeably nervous digestive system. Quote, before every game, he'd be in the crapper. He'd flush, and we'd all giggle, Tarrant recalled. Quote, and he spent most of halftime in the bathroom with the runs. I always wondered whether coaching placed an increasing strain on his colon. Lots of times, if you have colitis, the doctor will ask, are you under stress? End quote. Potato Ed, they called Ed Danowski, and that aptly described his coaching style. This is the head coach of the varsity Fordham team, the job that Vince wants. He had many attributes: athletic grace, handsome looks, sincere demeanor, but charisma was not one of them. no more sizzle than a half-baked spud. When Fordham's freshman class of 1947 moved up to the varsity the next season, so too did Lombardi, and though he was not promoted to head coach, he did most of the coaching, intellectual and spiritual, while Potato Ed, as one player described it, quote, stood in the corner and chewed tobacco. Fordham ran the T, as Lombardi taught it, and entered the season with raised expectations, which were rudely dashed with an opening 53-14 loss to a middling Lafayette team. The situation deteriorated from there, with losses to Canisius, Georgetown, Boston University, and Holy Cross. It was the first time in his career that Lombardi felt direct responsibility for losing, and with each loss he grew more intense and inventive, throwing as many trick plays as he could scheme into his basic tee. Fordham simply did not have the skill and depth yet to compete again at the big-time level. This mattered not at all to Father Gannon, who had already expressed his preference for safe losing and mediocrity. And it had no discernible effect on the disposition of Potato Ed, who shook it off with the sanest retort a losing football coach could summon, that it was only a game, quote, not life or death. Alumni boosters and their cohorts in the press box were fed up, however, and began hectoring for change. There were suggestions of bringing back Hugh DeVore, former assistant to Sleepy Jim Crowley, then coaching at St. Bonaventure, and even the fanciful notion that Frank Leahy, another former assistant, could be lured back from his prestigious post at Notre Dame. But most of the public speculation centered on Lombardi. Quote, rumor mill, Danowski out? Queried a headline in the New York Post with 2 weeks to go in the season. The story said, quote, Vin Lombardi, who gained fame as one of the Rams' renowned 7 blocks of granite, was said to be in line for Danowski's spot, end quote. The New York Journal-American's Barney Kremenko followed up with the change as a fait accompli, saying Danowski's days were numbered and that, quote, alumni had tabbed Lombardi as their man as far back as a year ago when he coached the Frosch to victories over NYU and Rutgers. But the fact that Danowski's contract had another year to run caused complications, and the embarrassing matter was dropped, end quote. In his Sports Chatter column, Harry Singer offered the opinion that Danowski's, quote, lack of color and personality were the main reasons he'd be replaced by Lombardi, quote, who is rated just the opposite from the present Ram coach and who will make personal appearances and is a good mixer, end quote. Lombardi neither pushed the speculation nor made an effort to quash it. Every morning during his commute from Englewood to the Bronx, he fretted aloud about the stressful situation he found himself in. He expected to be made head coach and wanted the job, but he did not want to be seen as Potato Ed's betrayer. He felt responsible for instructing the players, preparing them for each game, but it was still Danowski's team, and he was frustrated by not having true authority. As the controversy bubbled up around them, Danowski and Lombardi, barely on speaking terms, nonetheless devoted themselves to ending the season in respectable fashion. The Rams played spiritedly while losing to Rutgers in the penultimate game, after which a sympathy backlash for Potato Ed began to emerge. Leading sports writers who had covered him during his days with the Giants began to comment on his goodwill and decency. President Gannon, working behind the scenes against the blatant move by some alumni to restore big-time football at Fordham, was only too willing to become a private source for pro-Danowski stories. Danowski was also aided by the neutrality of the most influential member of the Alumni Advisory Board, Wellington Mara, owner of the New York Giants. Then and later, Mara's relationship with Lombardi was overstated by many. They had been classmates at Fordham, but were not pals. Mara felt just as close to Danowski, who had been one of his players with the Giants for 8 seasons. Quote, I don't know that I had any role, Mara said decades later of the dispute. Quote, but I tried to stay away from that whole thing. The players were torn. Some considered Potato Ed adults. A few thought Vince was a martinet, but most of them liked both men for decidedly different reasons. Danowski's ease, Lombardi's contagious will to win. On the weekend before the season finale against NYU, Herb Seidel, the team captain, was called home to Indiana to care for his father, who had fallen off a ladder. When he returned on the Friday after Thanksgiving, the day before the game, he could sense a, quote, enormous amount of strain in the locker room. Players were being called in one by one to talk to Father O'Brien about the coaching situation. O'Brien told Seidel that he was taking an informal poll and that the players seemed to be unanimous in their support of Danowski. Well, Seidel responded, all the players knew who was doing the coaching. It was Lombardi. He left the meeting convinced that, quote, the cards were stacked against Vinny and that the administration was, quote, trying to create the illusion of support for Danowski. The next day, Fordham played its finest game of the year, smothering NYU 26-0, and the salvation of Potato Ed was assured. Quote, if Ed Danowski's job as head coach of Fordham wasn't saved by that endorsement his players gave him in chalking up the traditional game with the Violets for their beloved mentor, wrote Dan Parker in the New York Mirror, quote, then there's no balm in Gilead, end quote. The balm arrived a week later, after a long Friday night meeting between Father O'Brien, acting on behalf of President Gannon, and Jack Coffey, the athletics director. It was arranged that Danowski would receive a new contract and a raise. He was to fire two of his assistants, but keep Lombardi, even though Danowski had made it clear that he could not stand the sight of his threatening aide. If this was a compromise, it was, quote, not a happy arrangement, noted Tim Cohane, who'd been following the careers of Lombardi and other Fordham athletes since his days as the school's publicist. Cohane had left Fordham in 1940 to enter the world of major sports journalism, his longtime ambition. He started at the New York World Telegram, writing a column entitled Frothy Facts and covering college football and the Brooklyn Dodgers baseball team. Then in 1945, he moved on to Look magazine, where he served as sports editor. He was still plugged in at Fordham and, in fact, had been lobbying for Lombardi's takeover of the football program. When that maneuver flopped, he received word that Vince and his dream of leading the Rams back to national glory were crushed. Lombardi had not found his way home after all, but had merely drifted through 2 more lost years. He needed a way out again. The man who had created the mythology of the 7 blocks of granite soon had another plan for him. One school, one football program stirred Cohane's soul as much as the old maroon. On an afternoon in early December, he met his favorite coach, Colonel Earl H. Red Blake of Army, at the Eastern College Athletic Association meeting at the Biltmore Hotel in New York. On the way to dinner, Blake casually mentioned that he was losing his offensive line coach and needed a replacement. Know anyone? Blake asked. Yes, sir, Cohane said. He thought he knew just the right man for the job. It's the end of chapter 5. On to chapter 6. I'm going to take a drink of water. As we mentioned, as I've mispronounced and screwed up and butchered various words over the course of this thing, this is not an audiobook. This is just me coming to visit you and hang out in the nursing home and wherever you might happen to be and give you a little cheer. Chapter 6, Fields of Friendly Strife. Lombardi drove north from Englewood up Route 9W, high above the Hudson River, the roadway along the Palisades framed by fresh snowbanks and slicked with sleet and ice. He was on his way to the United States Military Academy at West Point on this December morning in 1948, a brave new world for him, and the journey was not an easy one. When he reached their gate at the south end of the academy, he declared that he had an appointment with the football coach, then negotiated his way up Mills Road, past Mitchie Stadium and Lusk Reservoir, and down toward the gymnasium. Even in the somber shroud of early winter, the panorama was at once majestic and intimidating. Massive stone everywhere, barracks and cliff, Gothic spire, long gray coats, vast snowy plain, broad, cold river. When Lombardi reached the gym, he rode the elevator to the top floor and climbed another flight of stairs to an office in the tower. There, in front of him at the secretary's desk, talking to an aide, stood Colonel Red Blake, the man Lombardi had come to see. He was an imposing sight, 6'2", lean and immaculate at age 51, with bronze hair and serious pale blue eyes. Quote, Sid, take a look at the hands on this man, Blake said when Lombardi extended his butcher boy thick right hand in greeting. Quote, easy to see why he was a block of granites. He was talking to Sid Gilman, his line assistant, who was leaving to coach at the University of Cincinnati and whose position Lombardi hoped to fill. Blake's seeming familiarity with the 7 blocks of granite was, in fact, rehearsed. He knew nothing of Lombardi before a recent briefing from Tim Cohane, who had brokered the interview, and he harbored doubts that Lombardi's coaching background prepared him for this job. The men retreated to the coach's inner sanctum, warm lighting, dark walnut paneling. On one wall in bronze hung a West Point coat of arms. Behind Blake's mahogany desk, on which stacks of mail were neatly piled, was a large framed photograph of a saluting General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. military forces in the Far East, who had been superintendent at West Point when Blake played football there shortly after World War I. MacArthur was Blake's hero, the #1 fan of Army football. Pleasantries quickly gave way to the substance of the job interview, a doctoral examination on football methodology. What pulling technique do you teach your offensive guards? Blake asked his prospective assistant. The crossover step, Lombardi answered, rising from his chair to demonstrate the move he had learned under Sleepy Jim Crowley and Frank Leahy at Fordham, swinging his right arm back in a fluid motion to propel the quickest turn. The idea is to pull with speed and still be under control so you can assume a hitting position quickly, Lombardi explained. Blake pressed on. What technique do you teach guards for turning up into the hole? Again, Lombardi returned to the fundamentals he had learned from Leahy, his former line coach, who is now gaining national renown as head coach at Notre Dame. Drop the outside shoulder, Vince said, and push off the outside foot. On defense, Blake asked next, do you favor the forearm shiver or the forearm left? I think there's a place for both, Lombardi said, hedging slightly. But I personally favor striking the opponent under the shoulders with the forearm left. Why? Blake asked. With a shiver, Lombardi answered, if you miss, they're into your belly right away. He tried to sound authoritative, but had no idea whether he was making points with the unrevealing colonel. Blake continued with the gridiron interrogation. What technique do you teach for downfield blocks? The roll block. If you miss the target, Lombardi explained, he still backs away, and it's enough to tie him up. That's what we teach, Blake said. The colonel was impressed. Lombardi seemed as taken with football nuance as he was. The question and answer session persisted for nearly 2 hours until Blake ended the interview and treated his guest to lunch at the officers' club. As Lombardi walked to his car for the drive back to Englewood, Blake seemed noncommittal but encouraging. He said he would call. That night, Tim Cohane, curious about the results of his matchmaking, placed a call to Blake to see how it went. As Cohane later remembered the conversation, Blake said of Lombardi, quote, he's all right. Pressed further, Blake added, quote, he's a rough soul. Cohane knew that Blake was never impulsive in judgment, rarely effusive in praise, but was that a psychological assessment, a compliment, a criticism? Perhaps all three. The next day, Blake's office called Lombardi and asked him to return for another interview. This time, Vince rode the train north through more icy weather and met with Blake alone in the tower. Blake discussed West Point, the history of the academy, the winning tradition of the football team since he arrived as head coach in 1941, and then went over Lombardi's background and salary at Fordham. He never asked how much Lombardi wanted, but stated that the job would pay $7,000 with free housing included. He also mentioned that there was a grade school on the post for young Vincent, who was 6, and his little sister, 1-year-old Susan, when she reached school age. Blake cautioned that he had to gain final approval from the athletic board, but Lombardi descended from the tower this time knowing that he had the nod. It was not the top job that he had yearned for, still just an assistant's position, but being hired by Blake was nonetheless a significant achievement. Now he'd be coaching in the big time and learning from the best. Blake was the dominant college coach of the 40s. He was an offensive wizard whose teams from 1944 through 1946, led by the famed tandem of backs Glenn Davis and Doc Blanchard, Mr. Outside and Mr. Inside, had amassed prodigious point totals, a tie with Notre Dame the only blemish on their record. His 6th-ranked 1948 team had also finished unbeaten, though not perfect, having been tied by Navy in the season-ending rivalry. Blake could hire virtually anyone he wanted. and he had selected an assistant less than 2 years removed from a small Catholic high school in North Jersey. Before leaving West Point this time, Lombardi was shown around the post by another assistant coach, Doug Kenna, who had played quarterback for Blake during the war years. Kenna found Lombardi engaging but nervous and uncertain that he could adjust to the military environment. On New Year's Day 1949, at 8 in the morning, Lombardi attended his first meeting of the Army football staff. The holiday session was one of Blake's annual traditions, reinforcing the idea that no team in the nation would get the jump on Army. That was the essence of Red Blake, the most prepared man Lombardi had ever met. And there was much to get ready for this year. Blake had 2 new coaches under him, Lombardi for offense and another young bull, Murray Warmath of Tennessee, for defense. 18 graduating lettermen had to be replaced, 7 of them defensive starters, and the schedule was more difficult than usual, with early games against top-ranked Michigan and Penn States. Lombardi and Warmath had met once before. 15 years earlier, they had smacked each other around on a November afternoon in the Polo Grounds, Warmath lining up at left guard for Tennessee, Lombardi at right guard for Fordham, which prevailed that day 13-12. Now the 2 tenterfoot coaches shared a desk in a communal war room below Blake's office and were brought together in a trying initial assignment. They were called up to the blackboard several hours each day for the first week, diagramming plays and formations, defending their ideas against Blake's piercing questions. It was a variation of Lombardi's first job interview, but this time for keeps. At one point, Lombardi found himself in a heated debate with Blake and the other assistants over the proper way to deliver the center's snap to the quarterback. Blake had always taught the half turn of the ball, presenting it to the quarterback sideways. Lombardi preferred the quarter turn, with the ball reaching the quarterback at a slight angle. It was quicker, he said, and made it easier for the quarterback to hand off or pass. Blake disagreed, so they got out a ball and practiced both methods there in the conference room outside Blake's office. The quarter turn proved faster by the fraction of a second. When spring practice opened on March 12th, Lombardi began to appreciate the totality of Blake's preparedness. The coaches reported at 8 each morning, spent the first hour on correspondence, then convened at 9:15 for a staff meeting to establish the precise missions and chronology of that afternoon's practice. From the moment the players left the dressing room at 3:45 until they walked off the field at 5:15. The athletes had only a limited amount of time for football in their regimented days, sandwiched between final class and dinner formation at 6 o'clock, so nothing was left to chance. A set amount of time was devoted to each drill. 15 minutes for line blocks, 15 minutes for back blocks, 15 minutes for the blocking sleds, 15 minutes at the end for all the units to come together and work on new plays. Blake discouraged assistant coaches from bringing papers with them onto the field. They were expected to memorize the plays and blocking assignments of every player. At first, Lombardi had trouble keeping pace. Quote, "Run number 10, Blake commanded from the rear of the offensive unit, forcing his assistant to confess that he had not yet found time to install play number 10. Quote, "Blake just gave me his bland Scots stare," as Lombardi later described the scene. Quote, "Run number 11. He'd order. After practice, the coaches broke for dinner and then often were expected to return to the gym, sometimes working until midnight. Photographs and motion pictures had been taken of that day's practice and were developed and waiting for the assistants to study in the evening, along with films of future opponents. Blake was a film fanatic, one of the first football coaches to analyze the game play by play, position by position, methodically charting another team's tendencies on each down at various positions on the field and tuning his offense and defense in response to what he had seen. When studying films of their own team, Blake and the assistants replayed the film to determine what every player did on each play, assigning grades based on the degree of execution. Football was Blake's life, his profession, and only hobby. He largely disdained the social scene beyond West Point and his house on the hill, where he and his wife, Merle, hosted parties for out-of-town guests on football Saturdays and group suppers for cadets on Sunday afternoons. He seemed to think about football 24 hours a day. You have to forgive me, I got so excited about reading today, I just jumped in and I didn't even look at the time. I never want to keep you past a half hour if I can help it, because I don't want to bore you. Oh, we got 2 minutes. Well, we'll do 2 more minutes. Watching film was his idea of fun, work, and play. Once, after he and his staff had studied Michigan game footage for several hours in the projection room near his office, Blake turned to Warmath and Lombardi and said, quote, "You guys want to have some fun?" It was a hot afternoon, and the assistants were restless. Warmath dreamed of a round of golf. "Heck," said the colonel to his projectionist, "open up the locker and get those Navy films out. Let's look at those for a while." Even in the off-season, the focus on football was relentless. Lombardi would be, quote, halfway through dinner when the phone might ring, and it was Blake saying, quote, "I'll pick you up in 15 minutes. They would drive to the gym and, quote, discuss personnel or play ideas late into the night. It was then Lombardi first realized that, quote, football was a full-time 12-month vocation. In many ways, the philosophy at West Point was similar to a way of life that Lombardi had learned earlier at Fordham from the Jesuits. There was a direct line from one to the next, from religion to the military to football, from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius to the football regimen of Colonel Blake. Both emphasized discipline, order, organization, planning, attention to detail, repetition, the ability to adjust to different situations and remain flexible in pursuit of a goal while sustaining an obsession with one big idea. Lombardi was a daily communicant at both altars, absorbing what he learned from the Jesuits and Blake to become the leading apostle of the mystical discipline of football. As integral as religion was to his sense of self, it was not until he reached West Point and combined his spiritual discipline with Blake's military discipline that his coaching persona began to take its mature form. Everything he knew about organizing a team and preparing it to play its best, Lombardi said later, he learned at West Point. Quote, "It all came from Red Blake." End quote. It's very exciting now that he's at Army. Like he's had to divide his time throughout his entire career with coaching freshman basketball and teaching chemistry or whatever, and he's finally getting to do what Vince Lombardi was born to do over at Army. I just read that passage. I actually got chills in my arms. So, yeah, good stuff. All right. Thanks again for being with us again. If you want to pick up David Maraniss' wonderful book, When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi, the preference would be at a small bookstore, but right now during the pandemic, obviously that's problematic. If it has to be via Amazon or what have you, but get it. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He kind of knows what he's doing. So thanks again, and be safe, be well. Huge thanks to all of our folks, nursing, all the nurses, doctors, EMTs, the folks. Also, so many assistants in the local nursing homes who I've spoken with about this and attempted to share it with various nursing homes here so that you can have access to it and you can just have a visit on a day whenever you want. We'll get through this together. Thank you very much and take care.